In a small, quiet village, there was an old house. This house was not like the others. It was dark, with broken windows and doors that creaked. But in this house lived a woman named Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Harper was an old lady with silver hair and soft, kind eyes. She always wore a long, white dress, and she walked slowly, as if every step was heavy. Mrs. Harper lived alone. Many years ago, she had a son. His name was John. John was her only child, and she loved him more than anything in the world. When John was young, they were very happy. They laughed together, cooked together, and Mrs. Harper would sing him to sleep every night. Their house was full of warmth and love. But one day, when John was grown up, he told his mother that he had to leave. He wanted to go to the big city to work. He promised his mother he would come back soon. "I will be back before you know it," Mother John said with a smile. Mrs. Harper's heart was heavy, but she did not stop him. She kissed his forehead and waved goodbye as he walked away. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. But John did not return. Every day, Mrs. Harper would wait by the window, hoping to see her son. She would prepare his favorite meals, thinking, "Maybe today, John will come home." She would sit at the table with 2 plates, but only one was ever used. As the years passed, Mrs. Harper became sadder and quieter. The village people would sometimes see her walking alone in the garden, talking to herself. They would hear her soft voice calling John, "Where are you?" But John never answered. The villagers felt sorry for Mrs. Harper. They knew she was waiting for her son, but they also knew that John was never coming back. Some said he had forgotten about his mother, that he had a new life in the city. Others whispered that something terrible had happened to him, but no one knew for sure. One cold winter night, a strange thing happened. The villagers saw a light in Mrs. Harper's old house. It was not just any light, but a soft, glowing light that seemed to come from the very walls. They were surprised because Mrs. Harper never used candles. She was always careful with fire. The next morning, the light was still there. It was as if the house was alive. The villagers were scared, but they were also curious. They decided to visit Mrs. Harper to see if she was all right. When they arrived at the house, they knocked on the door, but no one answered. They knocked again, louder this time, but still there was no sound. The door creaked open on its own, and the villagers slowly walked inside. The house was cold and dark, except for the strange light. It seemed to come from the living room. The villagers followed the light and found Mrs. Harper sitting in her old chair by the window. Her eyes were closed, and she looked peaceful. But something was wrong. She was not moving. One of the villagers touched her hand, and it was cold as ice. They realized that Mrs. Harper was gone. She had passed away, sitting in her chair, waiting for her son. The villagers were sad, but they were also relieved that she was no longer suffering. They decided to give her a proper burial and let her rest in peace. But the strange light did not go away. It stayed in the house, shining softly every night. The villagers did not understand why. They thought maybe it was a sign, or maybe Mrs. Harper's spirit was still there, waiting for her son. Time passed, and the story of Mrs. Harper became a legend in the village. People would talk about the old lady who waited for her son and the light that never went out. Some said they could hear her voice at night, calling for John. Others said they saw her shadow in the window, still looking out for him. One day, a man came to the village. He was tall, with dark hair and sad eyes. He looked tired, as if he had been traveling for a long time. The villagers watched him as he walked through the streets, asking about the old house. "Do you know Mrs. Harper?" he asked a villager. The villager looked at him closely and realized who he was. "Are you John?" the villager asked. The man nodded, tears filling his eyes. John had finally returned, but he was too late. The villagers told him what had happened, and John's heart broke. He went to the old house, where the light was still shining. He walked inside, and everything was just as his mother had left it. The 2 plates were still on the table, one unused, and the chair by the window was empty. John fell to his knees and cried. He cried for his mother, for the time they lost, and for the pain she must have felt waiting for him. He cried until he had no more tears left. As he cried, the light in the house grew brighter. It surrounded him, warm and comforting, as if his mother's arms were around him. John felt her presence, and he knew that she was still there, still waiting for him. "I'm sorry," Mother John whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't come back sooner." The light seemed to flicker, as if answering him. John stayed in the house for many days, talking to his mother, telling her about his life in the city and how much he missed her. Finally, one night, the light started to fade. John knew that his mother was finally at peace. She had waited for him, and now she could rest. The next morning, the light was gone, and the house was just an old, empty house again. John left the village, but he carried his mother's love with him. He never forgot her, and he knew that she was always with him, watching over him. The villagers never saw the light again, but they remembered Mrs. Harper's story. They knew that love was stronger than anything, even death. And they knew that Mrs. Harper and her son were finally together in a place where they could never be apart again. Sometimes we wait for someone we love, not knowing that they are always with us, even if we can't see them. Love never truly leaves us, it stays in our hearts forever. Have you ever felt the presence of someone you love? even when they are not with you. Share your thoughts in the comments.